Hello there world, I'm the Talking Mausoleum and welcome back to my Elden Ring PVP guide, where today finally everything is about the most optimal way to spend your stat points for your PVP build. Like, I say finally because by now I announced that this would be the next video in our series multiple times, only to then talk about something else in the following video regardless. But that's because to know how to spend your stats, you first have to know, for one, how many of them you have, ergo your desired rune level, what weapon or weapons and spells you'll end up using the most, and also how heavy your overall equip load will be. So that's why we covered all that stuff in our previous episodes, and I encourage you to go watch those first if you're still relatively new to PvP. In this video, as always, we'll start off with all the general information we need, then take a close look at the passive stats Vigor, Mind and Endurance and talk about some numbers that will apply to almost any builds. Next we'll dive deep into the stats that actually help us deal damage, and finally we'll take a look at how to figure out what the optimal starting class for your particular build would be. So this video is about trying to find the most optimal stat spread you can have for any kind of build. If you go to make your build and find that you have to spend another 4 points in endurance to wear the armor you like, or you want to spend 3 more points in faith to use a specific spell, you can always do so. It's not like your build will be completely unplayable because of that, but chances are it won't be the most efficient way to spend your stats, and that's what we'll be looking at here. The way I decided to do this is by going over each and every stat that we can spend levels on one after the other, looking at what they can do for our build and provide you with some numbers and some more general considerations that will enable you to figure out how many points you want to sink into each of them for any build you'd like to do yourself. I will also provide concrete examples from my own builds to help illustrate what we're talking about, but I figured it might be cool to also do a little offshoot mini-series on PvP build showcases on this channel, so that's where we'll talk more in depth about specific builds. Here I just want to hand you all the data necessary so you can comfortably do the build building process yourself. In addition, when writing the script, I struggled hard to include all relevant information on both the stats itself, as well as on the plethora of talismans that can influence the way you spend your levels in just one video. So I eventually decided to only focus on all the different stats here and talk about talismans in our next episode. I will still briefly mention talismans as they become relevant to certain stats, but for now just keep in mind that they exist and can and will definitely influence how many levels you spend on certain stats. Also, in order to keep this video at a somewhat reasonable length, we'll mainly focus on builds for the meta level of 125, but most of the information I will give you is also applicable to any other kind of build, as you will see. By the way, all stats have some secondary effect, like Vigor not only increasing your HP but also your fire resistance and immunity, or Mind increasing FP as well as your focus. But those secondary effects can generally be ignored for the most part, since they won't net you enough benefit for the investment they cost you. Oh, and one last quick aside. As I was editing this video, we just casually broke the 200 subscriber barrier, and I'm honestly at a loss for word on how to express my gratitude for all the love and support you beautiful people have shown me over the last weeks. So thank you so much. And now let's get cracking and talk us some stats. Going forward, you'll see me use 2 excellent tools that make planning your build that much easier. One is the build planner from EIP Gaming and the other is the character planner from eldenplanner.com, both of which I'm going to link in the description of this video. Personally, I feel the EIP planner is just a little more useful since it actually calculates the damage you'll do with your chosen weapon pretty accurately, but the Elden Planner has a very useful feature of letting you calculate the optimal starting class for the build you're going for, so that's mostly what I use it for. Alright, let's start with Vigor. Vigor mainly determines our health. Like, duh. There are certain breakpoints that I will recommend you reach depending on the level you're going for, but since talismans like the Crimson Amber Medallion can also give you a significant HP boost, I think it's more beneficial to look at the final HP total you want to achieve rather than the Vigor stat alone. The HP increase of talismans is percentage based, so the higher your base Vigor, the more benefit you will get from them. So for example, for a level 40 build, I would advise you to get your Vigor up to somewhere in the ballpark of 25 to 30, but definitely try to reach an overall HP of around 900. A level 80 build would aim for something between 40 or even 45, where you should have an HP total of around 1600 at the minimum. And at the meta level of 125, you definitely want to reach the soft cap of 60 Vigor, only staying slightly below that if you really can't make your build work otherwise. 60 Vigor without any stat boosting gear will net you 1900 HP, but your overall HP at level 125 should definitely be upwards of 2000, so at this point utilizing talismans is pretty much mandatory. The reason you want as large a health pool as possible is that your survivability heavily depends on it. If you go for 55 instead of 60 Vigor on our level 125 build, even without talismans you lose around 100 HP. That might not seem like a lot, but those points will be the difference between barely surviving an attack and being able to back up and heal, or just dying on the spot, which will of course heavily influence the enjoyment you get out of your PvP. With how high the damage in Elden Ring is, you really want to do everything you can to keep yourself from getting one-shot, because how good you are at PvP combat won't matter at all if you never get the chance to fight longer than a couple of seconds. Think of your health pool as a measure of how many mistakes you can make while fighting, and with a slim HP total you can maybe get hit once, but the second hit will almost certainly kill you. So upping your vigor as much as possible might make you able to also survive the second hit, which is crucial because your opponents will usually go hard after you once they sense that you're close to death. Forgive me for maybe stating the obvious here, but this series is still meant to also offer PvP beginners a way in, and in that case in particular it's often easy to think, oh, I will just go a little lower on health and then I can use this or that spell on my build too. And more often than not that's not going to be worth it in PvP. Rather focus your build on doing one thing really well and just make another build for whatever else it is you want to do. But back to Vigor. As a rough rule of thumb, you could say that with every 10 levels you level up your build, you should put about 4 of those into Vigor, which will net you a health increase of around 30 HP per level up to level 25, roughly 40 HP from level 25 to 35, and close to 50 HP from 35 to 40. From 40 to 50 Vigor you get around 25 HP per level, and from 50 to 60 it's something like 20 HP. Obviously all those numbers are somewhat rounded. After reaching the soft cap of 60 Vigor we only get around 6 or 7 HP per stat invest, which is why you'll probably want to stay at 60 even if you want to do a higher rune level build like 150 for example. So these breakpoints are a good baseline to aim for with any build that's mainly focused around traditionally fighting your opponents with a melee weapon. But obviously there are also exceptions to how much vigor you want, like dedicated glass cannon builds. Say you want to use both rupturing tears in your wondrous physics to suicide bomb both you and your opponent quickly, then obviously the amount of health you have isn't going to be very important. And in general, mages might stay a little lower on HP than everyone else, because 1, they tend to stand further away from the heat of battle, and 2, they need the extra points for our next stat. And that is of course Mind. So Mind determines our FP, which we need to cast spells and Ashes of War, as well as use certain consumables. If you're not going to do a spellcaster build, 99% of the time you don't want to touch this stat. Even at a level 125, putting points into Mind over any other stat is not going to be worth it. Ashes of War generally don't cost a lot of FP, so putting more points into your damage dealing stat is almost always going to be more beneficial. And even as a spellcaster you don't want to blindly get Mind as high as possible. Rather you want to look at the specific FP costs of the spells you want to cast and do some math. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry. So say you want to do a level 125 Pyromancer build for duels. You want to start off your duel by casting Flame Grant Me Strength for 28 FP, be able to throw at least 2 Giant Flame Take These at your opponent for 32 FP each, and then still have enough FP left to cast Catch Flame for 10 FP at least once when your opponent tries to get close to you, before you have to refill your FP with a flask. In order to do that you will need at least 28 plus 2 times 32 plus 10 FP. That's 102 FP in total, and for that you will need 17 Mind, because that gives you 105 FP. Which coincidentally is also what you need to cast 3 Giant's Flames when at full FP, which is nice. So this would be your most optimal way of investing into Mind. If you'd want to cast 4 instead of 3 Giant Flames, you'd have to go up to 22 Mind, so that's 5 points more you'd have to invest there, and if we look at our overall stat spread, you'd have to take points away from either your health or your damage at that point in order to do so, which might not be worth it. If you just want to cast Stars of Ruin at your opponent at 38 FP per cast, 19 Mind would be what you aim for there with the 116 FP it gives you, enabling you to cast it 3 times before you'd have to drink your Cerulean Flask. And in the same vein you can calculate the optimal amount of Mind you need for any spell combination. So determining the amount of mind you need really comes down to what spells you want to be able to cast before having to refill, since that's always the moment where you're most vulnerable as a spellcaster. And because of that, you're going to have to do some testing regarding your combat strategies as a caster to see what spell combinations work best before setting on a specific value for your mind stat. For duels, that's a little easier, as the basic setup of any combat encounter will always be the same and you can really plan out your moves, and invasions are naturally a little bit more tricky since you'll never know exactly what situation you'll end up in, but the same principles still apply. For low level builds especially, having to account for these extra points in mind won't be an easy feat, and you'll either have to be very squishy with a tiny health pool or forgo being able to use most weapons. So while our level 125 sorcerer has no problems getting the mind he needs for our Stars of Ruin example, and we only have to make some minor concessions when going down to 80, if we wanted to do that build at level 40, we wouldn't have any points left for either endurance, strength or dexterity at all, and still be quite low on HP. In general, caster builds therefore seem to function a little bit better in duels at meta level or as part of a co-op team where your teammates can protect your fragile body. Whereas I would recommend you only use spells as a complementary part of your build as an invader and try to maximize your defenses first. Unless you're really only looking to get some cool ambush one-shot kills in your invasions and are fine with not being properly equipped to handle more traditional combat situations against multiple opponents. Granted, if you, like me, like round numbers, you're probably going to cry a little while doing this, but even at high levels, stat points are actually quite hard to come by, so you really don't want to waste a single one of them, and this is the most efficient way to go about it. Next up is endurance, and endurance is the only stat where its secondary effect is almost more important than its primary one. So endurance first and foremost increases your stamina, but secondly it also increases your maximum equip load, allowing you to wear heavier armor and weapons. Like with the mind stat, you want to go up as high as necessary for the loadout you plan to use, but always stay as low as possible as to not waste any stat points. In addition, like was the case with Vigor, talismans can once again help you reach your desired equip load in combination with your endurance. Since most actions in Elden Ring don't really consume a lot of stamina, running out of it will seldomly be an issue, and it's more efficient to just learn to play your build with the amount of stamina you end up with once you determined how much endurance you need for your equip load, rather than putting more points into endurance for the stamina increase alone. Regarding equip load, Elden Ring has 3 states of encumbrance in theory, that each give you a different roll animation that changes the speed and distance of your roll. In practice, however, heavy rolling, which you get at over 70% max equip load, should be avoided at all costs in PvP, since it makes it incredibly hard to avoid attacks, and fast rolls at under 30% maximum equip load will only be possible to achieve for builds that forgo using poise in favor of lightweight weapons and armor. With patch 1.06, FromSoft buffed the distance of light rolls, but at least for me, having higher poise with medium rolls still is the better way to go. Granted, I say this as someone who mainly does invasions in Elden Ring. If you're someone who primarily focuses on duels, light rolls are a very good option to help you outspace your opponent. And in those situations, you should also consider the Winged Crystal tier, which will give you plus 450% max equip load for 3 minutes, which will be enough to enable you to wear very high poise armor and still get your light rolls. Even for invasions, this is a very viable option, so powerful even that I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Winged Crystal tier wouldn't survive the next patch untouched. So if you're really only looking to win no matter what, you should definitely try that out yourself. I just don't personally like to incorporate time-sensitive effects like this in my builds myself. And of course, should your invasion go longer than 3 minutes, you would basically be back to having no poise at all. So for our purposes, we will assume that we aim for a medium roll, and for that we will want to stay just under 70% max equip load. And this is why, as we discussed in episode 3, really focusing on a specific weapon is so beneficial for your build. Say you want to mainly use the Claymore as your weapon on your strength build, but then decide that you'll also want to carry the Knight Rider Glaive for special occasions. If you set your build up to stay just under 70% with your Claymore, with everything else staying the same, you'll have to put about 2 more points into endurance when you want to switch to your Glaive to still be able to get your medium roll. Obviously 2 points doesn't seem like a lot, and it isn't, but small concessions like this do add up, and again we're trying to find the most optimal stat spreads here. Of course, having some more weapon options can also be very beneficial in combat, and for invasion builds especially, you'll probably never only carry a single weapon. But still, in these cases, and especially for duels, I would advise you to try to keep the weight as well as any other stat requirements of those secondary weapons below those of your main weapon. So if your build dual wields 2 claymores for example, but you also want a colossal greatsword to switch to, maybe go for the Zweihänder instead of the greatsword, so you don't have to spend extra points in endurance for those rare occasions where you bring out your colossal. Or just make a second build and focus that around the greatsword. Alright, so everything we talked about so far is pretty much applicable to any kind of build, but for strength, dex, intelligence, faith and arcane we have to get a little more concrete. These last 5 stats are our damage dealers and also dictate what weapons and spells we can use in the first place. The answer to the question, how much points should you put in these? As many as you can. For weapons with scaling in only a single stat, that's pretty easy. Just make sure you meet the stat requirements in the stats the weapon asks for, if it has any at all, and then dump every other point you have into the stat it scales best with. Something like the Warped Axe for example scales best on a strength build and only requires 8 dex, so just make sure you have those 8 dex and put everything else into strength. The Bolt of Grandsex on the other hand would require you to go up to 20 strength and then just dump everything else into dexterity. Some weapons have a split scaling where having a equal or near equal split between 2 stats will net you more damage than going all in on just one. Things get a little more tricky here, so a lot of split scaling weapons have their highest damage output at a 3 to 5 rather than a 1 to 1 split. So if we look at something like Malekith's Black Blade for example, on a rune level 125 build you'd want to have 50 strength and 30 faith rather than 40 in both. The Sword of Miles scales better with 30 strength and 50 dex than with a 40-40 split and so on. The reason for that is that the letters indicating a weapon scaling in the menu are not definitive values. They are actually divided further in the code of the game unbeknownst to us players, so think of them more in terms of grades where there's B's, B pluses and B minuses and you just don't get to know what you actually got. Therefore, unfortunately, the exact scaling breakpoints vary from weapon to weapon. So the Moonveil for example has requirements of 12 strength, 18 dex and 23 intelligence. Up to 50 intelligence, this is the stat that nets you the most damage, and after that you're better off investing in dex. But for something like the Giant's Red Braid for example, you should first get your strength up to 55 before investing more into faith nets you the better damage. In addition, the different stats usually also influence different damage types. For example, let's look at the Death's Poker. So you get the most damage for that weapon on a quality build, and again going 30-50 in strength and dex will net you a little more damage than going 40-40. Raising our intelligence doesn't do much for our general damage output at all, but the very powerful Ash of War attack scales purely off your intelligence. So in a case like this it becomes a question of what part of the moveset we really want to use the most. As a regular greatsword, the Death's Poker isn't actually all that great, both in terms of damage and range, but the Ash of War can do some heavy damage, so you might actually want to level in a way that will net you less overall damage but will be most beneficial for your best attack. So since for weapon scaling there really isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately there's no way around you having to look at the numbers in-game yourself. As we've seen, a 50-30 split for weapons with scaling in 2 stats is almost always a good starting point, but once you've decided on your main weapon, you'll want to upgrade it to the highest weapon level you want to go to, and then just play around with your stat allocation at Renala until it shows you the highest damage number in the menu. Remember that you only spend your level tier once you confirm the reallocation, so you can play around with your stats as much as you want there. And if you mainly want to use a weapon's Ash of War and that Ash of War does elemental damage like fire or magic, consider investing more heavily into faith or intelligence even if it gives you a slightly lower AR. But before I let you go off to make your own build, there is one more thing that we'll need to talk about. What starting class should you choose for the build you want? In this video all the builds I showed you were made on a Vagabond character, which as you'll see in a second is pretty much the most versatile class there is. And since you probably won't want to go through the game every time you want to just try out a new build, it's the class I'm going to recommend you use in order to make a mule character whose save file you can then back up and reload every time you want to make a new build. So in this overview I gave us a standard amount of 20 Vigor and 15 Endurance, just so these stats won't factor into our choice, since I'll assume that you'll always end up higher than that for pretty much every build, and the different starting classes are only relevant for the lowest level in each stat, where we can save some points. As you can see here, ignoring everything else, if we want to do a strength build, the hero class will be our best choice by 4 points. But as soon as we start increasing our dex past 10, to for example use a weapon that requires that amount of dex, the Vagabond starts catching up, and at 13 dex they are both equal. For a dex build it's even more apparent, as the Vagabond starts off only 1 point worse than the Samurai or Warrior, and at 13 strength we're tied again. And if you want to use some supportive spells like Bestial Vitality for example to have some healing options in invasions, getting to 12 faith with the Vagabond is also the most efficient for strength and dex builds. Now for you pure spellcasters out there, yes, the Astrologer will be the best choice for a Sorcerer, the Prophet for a Faith build, and the Bandit if you wanna go Arcane, if we assume that you want to get your mind up to at least 12 points. Otherwise, the Wretch would actually be the best choice if you really don't care about your weapon at all. But just in case you do, let's look at what class would be most efficient. If our Sorcerer also wants to use the Moonveil that requires 12 strength and 18 dex, the Prisoner actually beats the Vagabond by 1 point, but since this is the only build it will do so, unless you're completely sure you never wanna try out anything else, I would still go with the Vagabond here. Only on builds that really focus on the arcane stat will the hero generally be the best choice for your starting class. So I made us a little overview here that lists all possible builds for either completely focusing on one stat alone or a combination of two. One shows you the optimal starting class with no extra points put into strength or dex to meet weapon requirements, and the other column will have both strength and dex at 13. Unless stated otherwise, we'll assume that we don't care about how much mind we have, and that health and endurance will be up high enough so that it won't factor into our choices. As you can see, while the pure focus on a specific stat leads to a variety of classes being optimal, when you get strength and dex to 13 or higher, in order to have some more options in terms of weapon choices, the Vagabond pretty much wins every single time, save for the arcane-centric builds where the hero still comes out ahead, albeit by only a point or two in most cases. Of course, if you go out to make your own build now, I encourage you to use the tools I showed you in this video to figure out the best starting class and stat spread for your own build yourself, but I hope at least with all the information I provided in this video I gave you a better understanding on how stats work in Elden Ring. And that's pretty much all I have to say about stats. Next time, as I said, we will look at all the talismans there are in Elden Ring and try and figure out what will be the best options for our builds. If you found this video useful, consider leaving me a like and maybe even subscribe so you don't miss any of my upcoming episodes. As always, thank you so much for listening, have a wonderful day and see you very soon!